Hello, everybody, and welcome to this chat. It's the first one in a while that's not adversarial, and it's with Rubble
Yet.
of yes, exactly. We'll see.
Empires.
Yes, Rubble of Empires, aka Flying Spaghetti Gender. So, Rubble, why don't you tell us a thing or two about who you are and what you've been doing on YouTube and potentially elsewhere?
Sure. Well, basically, I started Rubble of Empires in response to some things that, in response to the gender identity thing. And the way that I experienced it was that I was probably aware of the concept of gender identity and transgenderism earlier than the general population, just by being around left-wing circles. And the first time I was ever introduced to it was I was part of a socialist group, and they were doing an educational on like a day of talks essentially on on feminism. And during one of the talks, one of the concept of transgenderism came up, and I was immediately like pretty skeptical of it, in my opinion, because it's an absurd idea. And they, like, the older people in the group explained to me what it was. And I said to them, like, oh, but what's to stop me from just saying I'm a really liberated woman and just declaring myself a woman? And they immediately kind of pivoted and went like, oh no, you don't understand. We were at a conference and there were these trans women there, and then there were these horrible other women who got up and pointed at them and said, you're not women, you're not women. So it was like the first, they were TERFs before TERFs were a thing, I guess.
Yeah.
And the like horror of somebody disagreeing with transgenderism in what could be perceived as a way was supposed to be enough for me to go, oh, okay, never mind my perfectly obvious question. I'll just say that might be upsetting to some people and go about my way. So I kind of initially, I actually took it on board and like agreed with it because I found something I wrote many years later where it was evident that I was using transgenderism unironically, or, as though I believed it was a thing. But yeah, I'd always be pretty skeptical of it. And whenever it came up in anything, I'd like, turn to the person next to me and be like, this is silly for this reason or that reason. And normally they'd like whisper back like, yeah, I know, like blah, blah, blah. And so that's how it was for a while, until basically watching this wave build and get to the point where it was undeniable. And instead of being a sort of thing some people knew about, it became a thing everybody knew about, and you had to have the specific line about it. And that was also when I noticed like you couldn't turn to as many people and say, hey, this is dumb, right? Because they'd be like, oh no, I'll get in trouble for wrongthink if I agree with this. And so I've been doing some organizing, or wanting to do some organizing at a certain point where I'd already gotten to the point where I don't believe in this anymore. And but it's not affecting me in any way, and there's no real way for me to engage with it that I think is going to really have any impact. And also the fact that it was so new and that it was changing so many things made me think, well, maybe I don't have this right. Maybe there is something here that I'm too old to get, or for whatever reason, like I'm not getting it. So, and plus I want to work with people who wouldn't work with me if they knew I was a TERF.
Mm.
So if I just like shut up about the TERF thing for a while and focus on the work I can do, then we'll see how that goes. And essentially I got to the end of doing that work and I started to feel that thing of if you can't, you need words to be able to express your ideas. And if you can't say certain things, then eventually you can't think them either.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was starting to feel that type of a dynamic where I was like, oh shit, I'm going to lose the ability to articulate these ideas if I don't get them down in one place. And so, essentially the thing from the script for Money and the Cost of Gender, which was a series of little cartoon videos that I made, was those ideas where I was like, no, I know this is wrong from this thing I learned and this I learned, and sort of put it all together in a way where I felt I was taking what was a Marxist analysis and applying it to the thing of gender identity and transgenderism, and coming up with a very different answer to what most of the quote unquote Marxists were now saying was, the party line on transgenderism. And so, that was the initial thing. I had a lot of similarities with Exelantic in that I framed the discussion as a atheist versus theist kind of thing, which she does as well. And initially my inclination was to try and replicate the things that had happened with New Atheism in when that sort of picked up on YouTube. Yeah. And I don't know if anyone remembers this, but do you remember in those early days, there used to be a group called the Rational Response Squad?
I feel like I recognize that term, but who was in it?
It was 2 or 3 people. It wasn't very many people. And there were other sort of people similar to this. But they covered their faces and they were like, we can't show ourselves because, people threaten atheists in America. Even though, no TERF is doing that today, despite all the death threats.
Yeah, that was kind of funny.
They were like, we're atheists. And they came up with a challenge called, what was it? It might have been the Infidel Challenge or something like that, where basically what it was there is allegedly some passage of the Bible that says that blasphemy challenge, that's what it was. That says that blasphemy is an unforgivable sin. And and so once you've blasphemed in this particular way, you're unusable to the Christian faith because you're already out, kind of thing. So I had fantasies of sparking some kind of thing similar to that where people denounced transgenderism, but evidently everything has moved on since 2006 except me. That never eventuated. But that's more or less what Rubble of Empires and my work has been about.
Yeah, a failed New Atheism clone.
There
you go. That's a positive. So obviously,
sorry, I'm just taking my shoes off.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. So obviously, you mentioned Marxist analysis as a big thing, which is really the main topic of discussion, because obviously you come from that perspective. And I was basically going to ask you questions about the Marxist assessment of the whole trans identity thing. And the first thing to kind of set the scene is what in, well, as simple terms as you'd like, or indeed as complex terms as you like, would you say as like the kind of Marxist analysis of sex, and particularly as it relates to kind of sex-based oppression in human society?
Sure. Well, I guess to begin with, like Marx's whole thing is historical materialism. And I guess he's, it's a sort of analytical framework. And the basic idea behind it is that, what do we got here? Yeah, is that you have two different ways of looking at the world. A materialist view of the world that or I guess I'll start with the idealist. The idealist view of the world is pretty much a religious ideal of the world, that like certain ideas exist first and then they cause material reality to become a thing. And like the Bible pretty much has that, like first there was the word or something in the creation story. So Hegel comes along and he's still religious, but he's arguing essentially that as well as there being the ideal, there's a relationship between the ideal and the material that kind of, there's an interplay there. And so Marx's like innovation on that was to say that thinking about those two interacting is the right thing, but flipping it upside down. And instead of saying that the ideal is the primary and the material is the secondary, the material is the primary and the ideal becomes the secondary, which is different to the materialists who had existed previously, which kind of didn't see a interaction between the two.
Yeah.
And so the way this works in like in history, in like historical materialism, is by analyzing how society reproduces itself and what mechanisms it does that by, and studying the evolution of human society as the growth of these different mechanisms and the development of them to various ends. So one of the things to understand first, I guess, is that there are different what are called like modes of production or social arrangements for how we produce things. And very crudely, you would have like hunter-gatherer would be a mode of production. There's something called barbarism, which is essentially like a slightly more early agriculture, essentially, where you're starting to get the development of class society. Then you have slavery, which is people being literally owned by other people and worked, and that's how the society produces things. Followed by feudalism, which most people are kind of given land and then a certain amount of their work is taxed by lords, and that's like another mode. And then capitalism is the mode beyond that. And each one of these modes of production produces different ideologies to essentially like explain itself as why we're working this way. And so the big thing with feudalism is the whole divine right of kings. The reason why I am king is because God said, like, me and my family are in charge, and that's why it's right. Whereas that kind of isn't the ideological justification for capitalism, because capitalism has sort of developed beyond the need for that same dynamic, I guess, or same old mode of justifying itself. And so just to, essentially capitalism has this thing it does where it's a class society, but it tries to erase the existence of classes and attribute things to nature and like, oh, well, this person is just naturally better than you, and that's why they have $500 billion if you're in sub-Saharan Africa or whatever it is. And so what I've written here is like, under capitalism, the invisible hand of the market is in charge because it is God. Basically, that's like the capitalist way of looking at the world. So to explain how that analysis looks at sex and gender, I just wanted to clarify.
Just to keep it simple, by the way, I was thinking I suppose actually I was going to say if you like, you can just focus on the sex, because I was going to ask about gender afterwards. But to be honest, I might imagine if you think that it's easier to kind of just do them both at the same time, you can. But if you think it's easier to just, I'm not sure whether or not it would be possible. So so it's up to you whether or not.
Sure.
Yeah,
it's
that's
kind of it's weird because they're like, there's such an interplay between the two. I guess I'll just go over gender real briefly, and then it'll come out more. But I wanted to say initially at the beginning, I forget her name, but there's a woman whose video clarifies these points, and she says that there are essentially three things that people are typically referring to when they refer to gender. And those things are biological sex, sex role stereotypes, and then gender identity. And so you've essentially got sex, ideas about sex, which are sex role stereotypes, and then feelings about ideas about sex, which is gender identity. So I think that's important to kind of separate out. So we'll be talking, I guess, I'll just try to be clear when I'm talking about sex role stereotypes versus gender identity.
That'll be,
right. So essentially, the development of human society as per the Marxist analysis is that in hunter-gatherer society, you don't really have the mechanism for classes. Like, you don't have the material capacity for there to be classes, because the tribe or the group of people is essentially requires cooperation to function. And there's not really like the ability to, for instance, start hurting each other, like hurting, and those types of things, because other people are kind of precious and they're a lot of hard work to, create and maintain, and they're viable and helpful. Whereas, often class distinctions are about like making one section of the population disposable. And in the early stages of human development, that's not the case. So then there are other factors. One of the factors is, I guess, scientific understanding. So the default organization for human societies is matrilineal, because understanding the matrilineal line doesn't require any scientific understanding. You just go, you came out of this person, so you belong to them, and that's how it works. And this is an idea that transgenderists like to like misinterpret. Like there is actually a reality to the fact that certain societies didn't have the same conception of biological sex as we do, in terms of they didn't understand that sex necessarily, or one act of sex could create a baby. So you can get different cultures will have different understandings. There was one culture that I used in Money and the Cost of Gender, where they were under the impression that it required multiple men to create a baby. So you would do a thing kind of where you would go around and go like, oh, well, he's good at reading and he's good at running and he's really smart. So I'll have sex with all of them and I'll get a reading, running, smart baby.
Yeah.
Yeah. And obviously what the advent of agriculture did was it made understanding the dynamics of sexual reproduction part of the society in a real fundamental way, because that's, you know, was economically important. Yeah. How am I going? Where should I go?
Yeah, all right, that makes sense. So I suppose how do you think that the kind of reality of biological sex, or to what extent do you think this was the kind of main thing that caused this, led to the idea of particular sort of economic roles for men and women? Like, do you think the idea of like at its core, the idea of men's jobs and women's jobs extended from biological reality?
It's hard to work out exactly why things happened. You can say, well, then this happened and then this happened, but why that led to that is kind of a more difficult thing. I think when you look at anthropology in general, it seems to indicate that patriarchy and class society are much more compatible. There are matriarchies that exist. Look, matriarchies are more common pre-agriculture, but they're not completely unknown post-agriculture. So I think there is some degree to which like a matrilineal society can be maintained, but I don't think it's as conducive to that for various reasons. And essentially, part of that, I think, is that the logic that would have gone to learning to domesticate farm animals was then essentially applied to human beings as well. And so one of the things that agriculture did was, prior to that, if you were in a hunter-gatherer society, it was really difficult to catch a guy and then say, okay, now I'm going to make you like hunt elk for me or something like that, because it required moving around and there wasn't really the kind of technology in place. Whereas once agriculture was a thing, you had something you could do with your slaves. You could make them farm. And so now, not only does that change your relationship to other people, but it changes the relationship to baby making. And making babies now isn't just a fact of, will this be, will this help us survive? It's like, will this be personally profitable to me? And so, yeah, I feel like those types of pressures were the pressures that gradually meant that men became politically dominant as they became economically dominant, and vice versa, women became less politically dominant as they became more politically irrelevant.
Yeah, that's interesting. What so with that in mind, I'm kind of interested in what the Marxist perspective, or maybe your specific Marxist perspective, because I imagine there's obviously going to be variation, would be in terms of how this idea of masculinity and femininity came about, because obviously eventually it wasn't just about this idea of men and women having different physical biological capacities, but this idea of there being a certain conception of like womanliness and manliness. So yeah, what's the story there?
Yeah, I guess, once you have developed it's like the king serf thing, similar in terms of now you have that material relationship, then an ideology starts to almost kind of naturally spring from that material relationship. So you start to see things that support it as good and things that undermine it as bad, and those types of things. So things around masculinity, leadership, not showing like emotion and compassion and that kind of thing. That's all, good traits for a farmer to have. Can't like care too much about their cows, or have your heart invested in anyone as an individual. And likewise, you want to have the female population kind of indoctrinated into motherly, domestic kind of roles.
Yeah. To what extent do you think this was something which like extended directly from like the material kind of biological sex roles versus like to what extent it was something, let's say early on, that was just kind of just made up almost like just because of like fashion and tradition? Like, do you think it, at least early on, always related to, there was a kind of a very direct connection between like, well, this is women's role based on biological capacity, and therefore, or do you think that was like from the beginning they kind of had like these nonsense ideas of like women like pink and boys like blue or whatever else?
Yeah, well, I mean, like there would have been masculinity and femininity in pre-class societies, like I imagine. Fashion and that kind of thing. But that's also, there's almost like a difference between, masculinity and say patriarchy. And so masculinity is about individual people and their choices, I guess. And then patriarchy is about economics and like the rule of the entire society. So I guess like, I'm trying to think of a racial analogy of something like colonialism versus being from Africa, or I don't know, like or something like that. Like they can still be races. Anyway.
So you'll work it out eventually, the perfect analogy you're looking for. But I was kind of interested in like, because obviously it seems like I'm wondering whether or not you would say there was kind of a change and variation in the degree to which this idea of like masculinity and femininity had an idea of like superiority versus inferiority attached to it. Because it would seem to me like nowadays, people who still kind of affirm the idea of masculinity and femininity being like kind of valid social constructs to even like, operate within, would probably tend to say, well, it's not that men are better than women, they're just different. Certainly in the kind of modern contemporary West, saying, there's like femininity, masculinity, most people who say that probably wouldn't be consciously trying to communicate that men are better than women. And I'm wondering, to what extent you think that was something which maybe changed or developed, like early on? Was it like way more explicit of like, well, all of this stuff was invented to say, well, women are inferior, or well, yeah, I'm wondering, yeah, what the relationship is between the idea of masculinity and femininity and inferiority versus like superiority.
Right. Yeah, I think it's the economics that underpins that that it's possible to have a masculinity and a femininity that just sort of separate, I guess, from class antagonism. But because of the way class society has developed, then now those things are now like so embedded and intertwined in that I feel like that's where it gets the hierarchy element sort of embedded in it.
Yeah. I'm interested, since you mentioned class. What would you say is kind of like the way that class affects this idea of gender identity? Because it would seem to me like one might think that looking at this, kind of history, it was often the case that the idea of masculinity and femininity was actually more pronounced in the upper echelons of society. Whereas kind of like when you talk about the working class, this idea of being like ladylike versus kind of gentlemanly wasn't so much of a thing. What would you kind of say is the way that class kind of affected this idea of masculinity and femininity?
Yeah, well, I've heard that too in terms of like the switch from feudalism to capitalism, that the notion of like housework and that kind of thing is relatively new, and that in a peasant family the types of like breakdowns where we're like the woman's role is the home and the man's role is like out at work, they were sort of muddled up and you weren't able to really like the lower people could live those out in the same way that like rich people could. And yeah, I guess it's probably similar to the way that it is today, that when people get more destitute, their ability to fulfill certain social roles or fit in properly and that kind of thing is limited, and as a result they can't play those types of roles.
Okay, I kind of wanted to move on a bit to talking about like this idea of gender identity. Do you think like there is any sense in which like gender identity means anything substantial from like a Marxist perspective? Like, when somebody mentions gender identity, is there any sense in which you understand that as describing something worth engaging with from a kind of Marxist perspective?
Not really. Like it's not from that tradition. I mean, it's worth engaging with just because it's everywhere, and it's worth, I guess, critiquing. But in terms of gender identity, it's as new to Marxism as it is to the rest of the world.
So what obviously there's the other kind of question, which is where do you think the kind of deeper origins, because I kind of wanted to talk about queer theory and like the kind of development of this whole idea of gender identity as like a kind of theory and like ideology, but before that I was just wondering if you had any kind of thoughts on where the kind of bud, I guess, of this idea, like the seed is really what I'm looking for, like the seed of this idea, and like in that sense kind of like the origins of why this idea came about of gender identity.
Sure. I think I've just got some notes here that were like, I think a similar thing is asking like a similar question is like asking, where did fire come from?
Okay, yeah.
In terms of like, yeah, it wasn't necessarily like there's one guy who invented the fire and now everybody knows about fire. It's that across the globe, different cultures were reaching like different technological developments, and yeah, that gave rise to fire being a possibility in certain circumstances, and then eventually became a like entrenched part of the way most humans interact with the world. And there are a bunch of things that are in place in America specifically that I think are the petri dish from which this ideology grew. And yeah, I think there's a number of different conditions that are all sort of interacting with each other. So should I like go start talking about those?
Yeah, do it.
Yeah, all right. Well, so I think the first thing in America is that you have even though it's a very religious society, you have kind of the death of the church, in the sense that there are certain things where the church comes into conflict with capital. So, for example, Sundays, like having some time off is definitely not a neoliberal kind of value. And you know, with the church kind of in its current state, where gay marriage is kind of defeated, like or its position on gay marriage, and you know, Sundays are abolished, and like, so there's no one of the features that like is important to modern America is that like the church is no longer a limit on capital. Capital rules it. That also means that you have basically no unions in the US, so you have very little collective resistance, and very little like considering problems as a collective problem. Like the classic American thing is like, I'll just have my gun. Like that's how I'll stay free. Because they have this very like cartoony conception of like, I will be oppressed because a man will come to my door and try to oppress me, and I will shoot him in the head and he will be dead and the oppression will be gone.
that is true.
So I think that's another factor. The fact that they don't have healthcare, I think, is a huge factor. They, you know, it's been said so many times that it's sort of lost its shock value, but every other developed country in the world has a free healthcare system to some degree. And the fact they don't have anything like that is fucking bizarre. And it also shows just how, you know, you just get thrown to the market. If the invisible hand decides you're going to die of cancer, then start selling meth or die of cancer. Those are your options.
Yes.
And added to which the the commodification of bodies, the rise of the plastic surgery industry obviously began in the US, and most of its innovations, I would imagine, are coming out of, you know, Hollywood and the places where the most expensive plastic surgery are being done. And then another thing that people talk about, or particularly Marx talked about, was the concept of alienation. I think that is important because, and just to kind of explain my understanding of alienation, at least. I feel like each development of a mode of production makes the alienation more thorough. So I guess, particularly the jump from feudalism to capitalism. You had, under feudalism, you had people farming, existing in nature, rising when the sun rose, going to sleep when the sun went down, paying attention to seasons, that type of thing. And then the advent to capitalism meant that you, and also you were working, there was more of a sense that you were your own boss to some extent, even though you got taxed at the end of the thing. There was, you weren't necessarily working for someone else. And that was a big thing. They called it like the disciplining of labor, when they're essentially trying to get all the peasants into the factories. And a big thing was, it was seen as degrading, essentially, to be an employee of somebody else. And that was a process that had to be broken down. Or an idea that had to be broken down. And so if you think about that, just like that, we're already alienated from the physical world just by being in like buildings and cars and like I can't even smell you right now. What a tragedy.
So basically, I mean, just alienation in some sense, obviously there's more kind of fanciness to it, is I guess a lot about like being separated from kind of nature and like the natural state of being, and kind of, the rewards we get from like the sense of you do a job that directly contributes to, like, so obviously the least alienated state would be like you go out, you hunt for an animal, or you pick some nuts and berries, and then you eat them. And it's kind of like a direct relation between the action you're performing and meeting a human need. Whereas conversely, you go to a call center, you call a bunch of people about a product that they don't want, that probably shouldn't really exist in the first place, and then you get a wage, which you can then use to go and buy food from a shop, which you then take to and that's way less kind of in tune with, like, at that point, there's no real relationship between the work you're doing, that you're spending like 40 hours a week doing, and actually sustaining yourself, apart from a very indirect relation. And that's alienation.
Definitely. And also the alienation of workers from what they're doing. So the difference between like an artisan or something like that, who might create a table and chair from scratch, versus like I work in a table factory and I put L1 screw into 5,000 different tables in a day. That's like another level of alienation. And so all those factors, on top of the fact that male circumcision is such a widespread phenomenon in the US, I think is also another reason why it was the place that this thing took off. And in big part because that John Money got his first non-intersex person to experiment on was from a botched circumcision. So it's not even just like theoretically related, like literally where they got disfigured people from was the fact that that's already a kind of normal part of US society.
Since you've mentioned John Money, I guess it would maybe make sense to move on to the actual history of the origins, and you can also mention Bonhoeffer. I can't remember the guy's name.
I wrote him down.
So the and I think just for the record, you can't mention by name, or it's risky mentioning by name, the people who were in charge of Germany during the 1930s and 40s. I think mentioning the specific word that people would associate with them can cause it can make YouTube angry. So just to avoid incurring YouTube's wrath, if you are going to mention them, just refer to them as the people in charge of Germany during the 1930s.
Sure.
But yeah, basically, yeah. So what, to clarify what I'm asking, even though, yeah, I think you already picked it up, but yeah, basically, what are the actual kind of origins of like this theory of trans identity, and like sex change and men in women's bodies and all that? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so there's John Money, and he was he's actually from New Zealand, but he was in the US, practicing in the US, and he was a sexologist in the 50s and continued being an academic up until like the late 90s. I think he died in the early 2000s. And he's where like the current modern Western conception of gender identity comes from. But there's also another guy called Magnus Hirschfeld, and he had a clinic in Germany prior to the mustachioed one
Yes.
taking over.
Yeah.
And his clinic was in some ways like similar to what John Money was doing, but I think I don't know, so many things happened in Germany in that period that
Yes.
meant that it wouldn't ultimately that wouldn't take root and become like a thing. But I feel like the factors, a lot of the factors that are in the US in modern times that have allowed it to fully flourish weren't there in Germany in the 1930s.
Yeah.
So that's why it didn't quite take off then. But the similarities between them is that they were like lots of John Money's stuff started with intersex people and anxieties around essentially trying to make intersex people look normal. Whereas Hirschfeld's clinic was more about trying to trans gay people, essentially. And they came up with this different theories, but essentially the idea that gay men were in some ways like demi-women, and they would, it's the first sex change ever was performed in that clinic. And
this was the clinic in Germany.
This is the clinic in Germany. They did a lot of different kind of experiments. They came up with what was he looking for? He was trying to like essentially prove that like lesbians were half men and homosexual men were half women. And so he was like looking for I was like as ridiculous as like I searched for semen in the menstrual blood of lesbians and stuff like that, where they were like trying to find boy things in girls that they couldn't find. And in, I think kind of related to but separate to that, there had been this craze at the time around like animal parts. And there was somehow the doctors got this idea that like inserting parts of like baboon testicles into the scrotums of gay men would make them straighter or more virile. And they even tried to do this with, apparently some people have 3 testicles. The third one doesn't descend. So they were like, oh, well, spare a testy for the gay men. And I think the war kind of put an end to this really becoming a problem and them disfiguring lots of people, but they were fully set down that road at the beginning. But yeah, most of that work got wiped out from what I understand.
And this is in like the famous like book burning, right? Okay. I was wondering, in your terms, like, because obviously lots of people will say like, oh, the reason why is because the people who burned the books were really transphobic. How would you describe the motivations of the book burning? Would you, what
I
was
don't
the
really,
reason why I wanted to do it?
yeah, I don't really know heaps about it.
Well, could it have
Uh,
just been because I would imagine a lot of the kind of people who might have been working on this would have been Jewish simply because like disproportionately high number of doctors. So could it just have been like, oh, it's like, because I obviously like the people who were in charge of Germany at the time literally didn't trust like nuclear science either because they thought it was like Jewish science. I mean, yeah, I was just wondering, yeah, if you knew anything about like
yeah,
what,
I think it like it could have been something like that. I
yeah, just a
mean,
generic kind of
even
like,
though a lot of the stuff that he was saying by today's standards was homophobic,
yeah,
the idea that he was trying to save gay people, even if it was through mutilating them with animal parts, that
it
was
was like too
probably
sympathetic to gay
yeah,
people.
yeah.
So that's yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like the Nazis are like, we totally get mutilating people, but mutilating people for good, that doesn't make any sense.
No, yeah, exactly, yeah. But yeah, they probably weren't there chanting that they stand with J.K. Rowling. So
No,
yeah, like
no,
that,
no,
yeah,
no.
they weren't.
Yeah, I imagine it would have been all homophobic, basically, because
Yeah,
the ideology wouldn't have necessarily, like, certainly wouldn't have permeated out of that clinic and into the party. So they
yeah,
wouldn't have
they
been using
wouldn't have really had a
that
conception.
framework
Yeah, a conception of that particular
of what
like
they were
idea of
destroying.
trans.
It just happened
Yeah,
to be doctors that weren't doing what we wanted them to.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, like some of the doctors went on and worked with the Nazis, and did what's his Erwin Gorbrandt. I think he was the guy you were
yes,
talking about.
yeah. I
Yeah,
got his name totally wrong.
yeah. He was yeah. He ended up doing really heinous medical experiments under Nazi rule, and then went off and became a wealthy and respected citizen before he died. So
Well done
um,
him.
yeah, yeah.
What an ally,
Yeah,
a trans ally.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
Oh, and I've got here
hmm,
Hirschfeld calculated the possible number because they were coming up with they didn't have gender identities; they had sexual types.
yeah,
Uh, so the possible number of sexual types was 43,046,721.
that's a lot.
Yeah, yeah. So you thought
43. Yeah,
67 genders was too many.
yeah, that's a lot. Wow.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. The real question is, did he put them on a spectrum? Because if he did,
Yeah,
it was woke.
yeah.
It was woke then. Um,
Yeah.
I'm interested in, so like obviously, yeah, you kind of mentioned John. So John Money was mostly active in like the 50s. Um,
His experiments
yeah,
were
yeah,
like
oh yeah,
his initial experiments with intersex babies before he got a hold of his first non-intersex infant.
yeah.
Should I go into that a little bit?
Well, what I was actually going to ask just briefly
Mm.
was what was there any kind of like were these just like obviously John Money versus this kind of Hirschfeld guy? Were those just two things that kind of happened to be occurring at the same time in parallel, or was there any interplay between the two individuals? Was what I was kind of wondering.
I have a feeling Money was slightly after Hirschfeld. And he was the dude. Like he was kind of the one who might have even like been the one who coined. I don't know if it was him, but he would have been around during the switch from calling them hermaphrodites to calling them intersex.
Yeah,
So he was like the expert. He graduated from Harvard and was probably one of the leading like intersex people in the country. So I assume if there was anything left over or anything known about the Hirschfeld clinic, he would have had access to it, and he
yeah,
also have known about it. But I feel like that would have mainly all been
kind of
gone, and there wouldn't have necessarily been like dialogue between the clinic and Money. But that would be something to look into, because I guess, you know, a lot of some of the, you know, that one dude lived till 1958 at least. So Gorbrandt. So he presumably could have been in communication with money at some point.
Yeah. So with that said, yeah, you now can, as far as I'm concerned, basically summarize the life and contributions to trans, theory and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, trans ideology of John Money.
Sure. So he comes around in the 1950s, and it's sort of like just as science is starting to try to recognize and grapple with intersex conditions. And he comes up with this, he starts performing sex change operations essentially on the intersex children on the basis that he can, that he knows what their sex is supposed to be, and that he can change their physical body accordingly to make their sex match up, or their genitals match up with their sex. And this is like a thing that he's able to do in part, I think, because one, no one gives a shit about intersex people and intersex babies. And specifically, no one gives a shit about intersex babies' genitals, because they're considered already like waste, essentially. And so when he came to people and was like, can I try and improve on this? The assumption was basically like, well, you can't do any worse than what's already been done. So have at it. And he was able to, he did this to hundreds of, many babies. In part, this was like a way of making the parents more comfortable, because it made you were able to say, like, here's a baby that looks like what you want it to look like. And so that was part of like what he did. And in some senses, I feel like he was essentially, for lack of a better term, like gentrifying intersex babies, in that it's like, ordinarily, like, intersex babies come from nature, and that's like poor and yucky and not a desirable commodity. But a surgery comes from a doctor, and it's like, stamped by authority, and it's a thing you can purchase. And for those reasons, it was more, I think he was able to sell this to people. And that went on for a while. Those operations still happen, from what I understand, but they're a lot less widely accepted. And lots of intersex groups have since come out and been like, it's a total violation of a patient's or someone's rights to do that type of operation to them when they have no ability to consent to it. And so, but before that was able to really happen, at one point there was a boy whose mum had taken him to be circumcised, him and his twin brother, and they were using this experimental circumcision technology where they essentially like cauterize, like use electricity to burn the foreskin off. And the doctors fucked up and burnt this kid's like dick completely off. And the mother was completely distraught and didn't know what to do, and eventually happened to see John Money on the TV, which is like so sad and depressing, like that it was so commercial and stuff. And she was like, oh well, this guy seems to think he can help us out. And that's when they went to John Money, and he said, well, I've got this theory which is essentially precursor to what is the modern gender ideology. It has some slight differences, but it's like pretty much how it is today. And one of his differences, though, was that instead of having an innate gender identity, which I don't even know if trans activists actually believe, because their gender identities change all the time and shit, so I don't know what they actually think. But John Money had this idea that your gender identity was changeable up until a certain age. And so he had this theory that he could take this boy and turn him into a girl by essentially raising him as a girl, and dressing him in, dresses, and restricting the type of clothes he could, toys he could play with, and who he could hang out with, and that kind of thing. And he proceeded to do this, and it was David Raymer was the name of the guy, the boy, and he hated it the whole time. The process also involved like some sexual abuse, it seems, or sexualized abuse, where he was made to mimic sexual acts with his brother in a male role and him in a female role to try and it's the type of shit you would think of, like you would catch like a bunch of 6-year-olds in the lounge room doing. Like, and why are you dressed up like this? Oh, we think we can turn one of us into a girl. Like,
yeah.
Oh, you idiots. So yeah, that's what he started to do. And eventually, at the same time he was doing that, he was telling the rest of the medical establishment, this is working, this is going great. I'm making a girl. He's taking to it like a duck to water, and she's taking to it like a duck to water. And because of his position in the medical establishment, most people were like, oh, okay, well, he's the expert, he would know. And so other doctors started making assumptions based on the idea that John Money's work was successful. And it wasn't until I think David Raymer in his like 20s or something, like because he disengaged with the doctor, I think around 13, and wouldn't go back anymore after like hating the whole process. And it wasn't till he was in his like mid-20s that he found out that John Money had been telling everybody that this was a giant success. And he started like speaking out against it. And so that's essentially the beginnings of gender identity. He also coined the phrase gender identity while
so anyone who talks about gender identity, it's from John Money. There's kind of two things I want to talk about, one very quickly following on from the other. But the first thing I wanted to establish for the record, because I already know this from you, but this was considered, like, this isn't something where like like basically even in like the 90s, John Money was still respected and things. So I just wanted to, could you just like, I guess, communicate the evidence for the fact that John Money isn't somebody who was viewed as like some dinosaur relic of the past, but actually relatively recently he was still respected as a scientist, and like the kind of scope of his scientific career, I guess, extended well into like the 90s and early 2000s.
I'm pretty sure Judith Butler mentions him in her work. He was still an academic. He was still studying and publishing. I'm not sure how he didn't like get in trouble for what he did. But he was definitely there was no, like, now trans activists know to distance themselves from him and will, and and that type of thing. But at the time, he was still very, well regarded, I think.
Yeah. So, but obviously, you kind of mentioned Judith Butler. So the kind of second question, which was following on from it, because obviously it's worth noting that he was still, like I say, a lot of people talk about him as if he was like somebody who was just like this ancient history thing, but no, he was still relevant, like in the 90s. But the other thing about it, obviously, I'm sure people will listen to this and, well, maybe the people, I don't know how many like gender critical people listen to this, but like they'll maybe observe that this doesn't sound exactly like the kind of modern narrative, obviously. Modern trans people who affirm trans identity would be like, well, trans identity is something you feel in yourself. It's something that's not, they would argue that it doesn't necessarily relate to medical transition. And they might say that, well, this clearly doesn't directly parallel with John Money, who basically tried to turn somebody into a girl based on the fact that they'd, had this like genital mutilation occur to them. So with that kind of distinction in mind, obviously, because Judith Butler was not repeating all the same stuff that John Money, Judith Butler and kind of like post 1990s, trans identity kind of became a different thing. How would you say, like, what would you say is the kind of story of how trans identity sort of evolved from those early days of it being like something that was very kind of, I guess, medicalized, and like almost exclusively medicalized and understood in terms of like strictly kind of extending from the material conditions of like somebody's body, to nowadays where it's kind of like this whole gender woo-woo stuff, and like just trans identities, innate trans identities and man and woman essences and all that. Both, and also I guess both how and also while you're at it, maybe like why, like why did this change in attitude occur?
I think that why did it occur? Well, there's essentially like the growth of postmodernism. Beginning with Foucault, and then Butler and other people. There's about 6 or 7 like key postmodern thinkers that are like related to gender, and I feel like initially postmodernism was just an interesting idea or an interesting kind of framework, like the way that I studied a little bit of postmodern stuff at uni, and the value that I saw to it was it doesn't have any, it doesn't care. Postmodernism doesn't care about anything. It's a like analytical kind of framework, and from that, for that reason, it can be good to use to like bug check or debug other ideologies, where you try to, in the sense that you can be like, okay, well, what's the hidden assumptions that this ideology is making, and you can like get to those by sort of pulling it apart. And postmodernism, I guess, is a very it like rejects the idea of what it calls meta narratives, or like grand ideas of how the world works. So for example, Marxism would be a meta narrative, which sort of says that, the development of class relations is how the world works. And in that sense, it's trying to pull everything apart, and it starts with like Marxism and that kind of thing, but then it gets down to anything like the word woman, and it pulls them apart, not necessarily because it's trying to like improve anything. It's just like, that's how it generates, articles and academic produce, I guess.
So
in that sense, like, you know, postmodernism was always going to do things like try and make the word woman meaningless, because it's trying to make everything like meaningless, or like
Yeah.
And so that is how it, like, that's just its sort of like thing, or that's one of its characteristics. The way that it developed into a full-blown problem, I think, is, or like the way that postmodernism came to dominate the entire society, in part through like gender identity, is partially through like deliberate encouragement. Yeah, I've got a video a while back on the CIA essentially funded all the early postmodernists, in part because they wanted to dethrone the Marxists in French academia, because they were worried about what Marxists were going to say about the US interventions into Latin America. And they knew the postmodernists would only question, is there even a Latin America? They weren't going to ask any difficult questions about genocide. And so I think it got its foothold sometimes through like literal, you know, propagation by various capitalist states to their own ends. And then it also became more powerful and more of a like dominant ideology. I think, essentially in the 90s, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, so like in '89, so that even though the Soviet Union hadn't really been something that, you know, people were striving to emulate, it was a counterbalance to some extent. And so when that collapsed, there was this idea of there is no alternative, the whole end of history conception. And once that, like the idea that, you know, there isn't going to be a slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, it stops at capitalism, that's the end. And I think like with the death of the Soviet Union, it basically meant that in the 90s, postmodernism became much more prolific, and it was like, you know, well, you can theorize about class or whatever, but like, you know, you couldn't accuse postmodernism of being naive or overly idealistic, because it didn't believe in anything or anything like that. So it was able to be seen as like, even though it's like primarily gibberish, it was like, at least dealing with the world as it was to some extent. And I feel like those are the general waves, in conjunction with the things I mentioned earlier about, you know, the various different things that had already been there in terms of, you know, healthcare, et cetera, that helped to lay the basis for transgenderism in the 2010s and early 2000s.
You've kind of almost answered to some extent what were going to be my next two questions, which was going to be, first of all, a Marxist analysis of why these ideas emerged now, and, you know, at this particular time, and kind of what the function of that was. And I think you've kind of answered that. But then the second question, which again you've also sort of answered, was the utility of queer theory for capitalism. So, like I say, you've kind of already answered that, but I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say in response to those specific kind of prompts.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's just hyper individualistic. Capitalism is all about, like, you know, the individual, the customer's always right. Like, that should be the trans slogan. not trans women are women, but the customer is always right. That's why whatever the customer says their sex is what sex they are.
Yeah.
And those types of things destroyed. You know, it was a great way to neutralize feminism, neutralize the gay liberation movement. And also, like, one of the things I didn't mention is that it's like relationship to pedophilia and child abuse is pretty strong. Like, there's a long, history of postmodernists, including John Money wasn't a postmodernist, but he also argued for like the destigmatization of pedophiles, essentially. And I think that's another aspect to it, because when you look at like I've heard that most television, most visual mediums are pioneered or were pioneered as a result of pornography, because when a technology is new, the people that will pay the most for it are the people who want to like wank off to it. And so they will help like get it past the testing phase until it's like viable, and then other people will go. And I think the unsaid part of that, and that goes from like DVDs, the reason why Betamax wasn't a thing and VHS won out was because VHS would allow pornography and Betamax wouldn't. All sorts of internet like technologies all pioneered through that. And I think the unsaid thing about that is that of that group, the people that are willing to pay even more than just your average masturbator is pedophiles, who are going to be like the core of the people who are going to invest shitloads of money into these different technologies. And so I feel like that's probably another kind of intertwined element of all this.
Yes. So that's interesting. Now, that's very interesting, but and obviously quite disturbing. But the final question, sort of, possibly to spawn a few more final questions, but is how do you think, therefore, that specifically Marxism can allow for kind of overcoming this trans identity stuff? Because obviously everyone's talking about like peak transing the world and all that, and like the tide turning. But yeah, what role do you think kind of Marxism can play in facilitating that?
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of it's not an idea. Like, I don't think we can. I don't know. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I have a feeling that it doesn't matter how much we peak trans people. If the material conditions stay the same, then those ideas will just get washed away, and the ideas that stay trans affirming will remain the dominant ones. So in that sense, like, I think if you were to actually we're trying to solve this problem, you sort of need to solve the problems underneath it. And that's obviously capitalism and class society. And I think generally one thing I would point to, or maybe even explain, because in all this talk of like Marxism and socialism, I hear so many people talk about it without a kind of conception of how it would actually happen. So just to clarify, like for people, lots of people have the idea of like a revolution is like people with guns and they go to the parliament and they throw the people out of the parliament, and that's a revolution. And so, but the idea behind like a Marxist revolution is, say, when you're at work and there's some component about your workplace that you don't like they're not providing you with safety gloves or something, for example. You could get that problem changed potentially through using through becoming a member of a union and collectively organizing with the rest of the other workers to put that demand to the boss to be like, you have to provide us with safety gloves. When you do that, you're now sort of partially running the business as well. There are two kind of power sources that are in control. And so essentially, what you're looking for with a revolution or for a Marxist revolution is a situation where you start to get such high density of workplace organizing that the unions can legitimately say like, well, we could run this place essentially ourselves, and by running it ourselves we can also run it for different reasons, whereas a capitalist can only ever produce something to make profit. We can run it for social good. And so rather than it being a conflict of like physical force, it's a conflict of organizing capacity. So at the moment, yeah, the US working class is completely disorganized. The capitalist class is very organized. And so that's the position they kind of play. And like one of the most promising things, like I used to say this is like, how are we going to get rid of transgenderism when the Amazon workers are pissing in bottles? Like they can't even win toilet breaks, let alone sick leave or things that unions in other countries would fight for. And just the other day, like 2 weeks ago, I started seeing stories about the Amazon union in New Jersey, I think it was. And it's the first Amazon like packing plant or whatever it's called to have ever unionized in the entire US. And that to me is like the beginnings of things that can start to shape the rest of society. But that's where it begins. Oh, hang on.
No, sorry, I didn't realize I muted myself. By the way, I was cutting my nails, which like people are gonna wonder why I was looking down while you were talking. It's because I saw my nail clippers and I was like, oh man, I haven't cut my nails in a while. But I was listening to everything you said. I assure you I'm capable of multitasking. But yeah, basically what I'm not capable of doing is rising now. I was muted apparently. So what I was wondering is obviously lots of the people who are now criticizing trans identity, a lot of them are Marxists, but a lot of them, and particularly the most popular ones, are liberals, and even some might say neoliberals. There are plenty of, like in the UK, Telegraph writers, Spectator writers, Times writers. These are all kind of like, your center-right newspapers who are platforming a lot of this kind of anti-trans stuff. So I kind of got, I think, two questions I'm going to pose to you at once, especially seeing as I think I have no real conception of how long this has been, but I think it's been a while. So basically, the two questions I wanted to pose to you at once was, one, do you think that liberals can actually achieve something substantial, at least when it comes to taking down this trans identity nonsense? And two, do you think that maybe actually that's something which might even be allowed for just to avoid, the alternative of like Marxism becoming more popular? That actually, like, it's possible that obviously capitalism isn't some conscious agent, but kind of the forces of capitalism would rather it was liberals like J.K. Rowling pushing for like being the thing, rather than people like me who'd spend the whole time talking about the importance of like material reality and, you know, relating that to Marxism.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it could. You know, capitalism existed for a very long time without gender identity, so
Yeah.
it does seem likely that it could do that again. And similarly with feminism and racial integration and lots of things that people in previous generations would have said, oh, the whole thing will come down if there's, you know, ever a black president or ever a woman this or whatever, and it just keeps on rolling. So I think it possibly may try to steer back to correct, and it doesn't have any you know, loyalty to gender identity any more than it does to any other like commodity it sells. The only thing I would say is that, like, the comparison I made was to brain scalping, lobotomies. And the reason why I think lobotomies were able to be reined in was because lobotomies, as far as I'm aware, didn't create a bunch of extra industries that depended on lobotomies. So when they turned out to be false, you could go, oh yeah, correct that. And, you know, the doctors that were doing that just did different operations, the nurses did different things or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas with gender identity, there are whole sections of, you know, various businesses and stuff that would disappear if there was no such thing as gender identity.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I feel like it'll be more difficult to get rid of.
That's actually a very interesting point. Yeah, there's definitely more financial incentive around it.
Yeah. And and you know, with the transhumanism thing too, like it lays by you know, telling you your body isn't like, you know, sacred or holy or whatever it is. It's like just a port to have different things plugged into. That's something capitalism loves, I think.
Okay. I actually think, like I say, I'm pretty sure we've gone for a while. I do get annoyed actually that Zoom doesn't tell you, or at least doesn't tell me, how long the call is, which obviously if I would have kind of really paid attention. I mean, I know we called at just approaching 12, which means it's been potentially, I would argue, we've been talking for about 2 hours, which is usually the upper limit. So I'll just say, obviously, I'm sure
I have one question. Remember, I had a question though.
You did have a question for me. Yes. Okay. Yes. You can ask me that question.
Okay. So in one of your videos, you were saying that I didn't realize you were Christian, which is cool. Well done.
Oh, yeah. I know. Yeah. I keep it a real secret. I'm clever.
Yeah. My question was, you said that Christianity was a more materialist religion than other religions.
Yes.
Because of the fact that the resurrection is seen as literally happening, then that means that it's literal, material events that people are responding to.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what is your opinion? And you said something about Catholics earlier, which might answer this question. But I was thinking, but what about transubstantiation, which is like transing bread and wine?
Yeah.
What do you think about? Do you believe in transubstantiation?
Oh, no, yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint you, because otherwise, it could be more. I feel like I could give a more nuanced response if I did believe in transubstantiation, but I don't. Indeed, actually, I fall hardcore into like the it's fine to have Ribena and grape juice camp, you know, like, as in, so, you know, like, which is kind of a very kind of like evangelical free church Baptist take of like, because obviously the Baptists generally tend to be against drinking, and I am teetotal for my part. So yeah, like I'm like, oh, give me that grape juice. So yeah, like yeah, my position.
Your problem isn't it's too magical, it's too alcoholic. It's your
yeah, exactly. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, my take is basically that it's uh purely symbolic, very very much so.
Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, which I don't know. I mean, I suppose actually I am kind of thinking to myself, like, is symbolism materialist? I want to say it is. Like, you know, like so yeah, I mean, so I guess it's kind of like, for me, it's sort of like how like meditation is something which I don't really believe achieves something spiritual, but rather it's just like a good habit for you know, like your mental health. And I feel like it's kind of like a similar thing with like symbolic practices. Like I would say it's like, I mostly am just like, yeah, it's a good like little routine. Anyway, so there we go. Yeah, that's admittedly, like I say, kind of a boring answer to your question, because to be honest, the answer could have been as simple as no, I don't believe in that. But I decided to stretch out a little bit. Yeah, okay. Cool. Anything else, or just was that it?
Yeah, no, that was pretty much
it. Fine.
Like, but yeah, or I guess how do you how is the resurrection material? Like, how does
Well, so basically, well, the thing about it is, like, actually, Christianity at its core is quite boring, in that the Gospels, from your kind of standard Christian perspective, the basic claim would just be, well, the Gospels are history, and they're history in the same sense that like anything else is history, which is to say, like, obviously, you know, there is debates about the provenance of the Gospels, but of course the Christian side would be to say, well, they were written by who, you know, they're traditionally viewed to have been written by, and they were written within like only a few decades of the events they're describing, and like basically the people who wrote the Gospels did so, you know, kind of like the proper way, by like asking eyewitnesses and like talking and like hearing everything. And within that sense, it's kind of like, it's basically just all the Gospels would amount to, therefore, is a series of descriptions about like events that happened in real life, and then it's kind of just like working out the implications of what actually happened. Yeah, to give a better explanation, it's probably something I would have to really not just
spend a bit of time, not just sprung it on
you. But also, yeah, like I say, but also, yeah, like I say, this was probably, seeing as this will probably be the longest discussion I've had for my Casey Talks series. I just feel like I can't tack on too much. But who knows? Maybe someday someone will try to interview me. They'll have me on their channel. Someone actually did. Fun fact. A lot of people don't know this. I actually have been interviewed on someone else's channel.
But I've seen that.
Oh, good. Well done. Do you know their name?
Something moderate or something?
Average centrist.
Average centrist.
Well done. Yeah, good. You remembered. Anyway. But okay, no, we should finish. So, any concluding thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much everything, I think. Yep.
Yeah, cool. All right. In that case, you can just remind everybody. Did I actually even say, like, did you even give a shout? You did, maybe? Did you give a shout out to your socials at the beginning?
I said Rubble of Empires on YouTube, at Flying Gender on Twitter.
Okay, and good. Yeah, and I was going to ask you to give a shout out again, which you've just done, so well done. And all right, so yeah, that's you could, so, and that's literally it. So all right, thank you for talking to us, or me, but by extension everyone else who's listening. Rubble of Empires, and also I suppose yourself if you listen back to this. So thank you for talking to anyone who's listening to this, even including yourself. All right, bye.
See ya.
Actually, you know what? Yeah, I'll probably do a little proper outro for myself now, because I can't be bothered with recording a separate outro. So that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching. Comment below to let me know what you think. Please do like, share, subscribe. I already said everything there. And if you'd like to go on Patreon, that's really appreciated. And I'll just say thank you to my current patrons. In addition to the names scrolling past on your screen right now, I would like to give a special thanks to last month's patrons: Anthony, Diana, June, Space Jack, and Rachel. You're all very appreciated.